There, self-care warriors, welcome back to Self-Care Haven. Today I wanted to talk to you about the differences between someone who is a narcissist or a psychopath and seems to have some sort of addiction versus someone who isn't a narcissist, who isn't a psychopath, who doesn't meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder or the criteria on Dr. Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist, yet they do have some sort of addiction. Now, the truth of the matter is, when you are dealing with a narcissistic or psychopathic individual, their addiction is a byproduct of their disorder. It's not because they are struggling with some sort of deep trauma or compulsive need to engage in that addiction. I mean, it's possible that they could actually become addicted to substances over time. However, even if you took away the addiction, you would still have a narcissist. You would still have the psychopath. You would still have those characteristics that make them exploitative, that make them unempathic, that make them remorseless, that make them conscienceless. What happens is that the addiction itself did not cause their disorder. Their disorder exists outside of the addiction. Even if you took away the addiction factor from a narcissist or a psychopath, you would still have their callous lack of empathy. You would still have their lack of conscience. You would still have that need for power and control, that need to exploit others for their own gain. Now, you may be wondering, what is the difference? Because you may have dated someone who was narcissistic, who was abusive, but they also struggled with some sort of issue, some sort of substance abuse addiction. And you might have thought to yourself, well, it's because the alcohol made them do it. It's because of their lack of control. They couldn't control the fact that they had sex with 20 girls, They couldn't control that. This was because of their sex and pornography addiction. This was because of their gambling addiction. Whatever that addiction may have been, you may have thought to yourself, well, what is the difference? How do I know that this person wasn't just really struggling with something that made them feel out of control? And that's why they did all these heinous things to me. So the distinction between a narcissistic addict and an addict who has engaged in narcissistic self-centered behaviors as a result of their addiction really comes down to motives, intentions, as well as the possibility for healing and change and the willingness to change and recover. There are some people who are so far stuck and deep in the despair of their addiction that they're not able to change, that they're not willing to ask for help, and unfortunately they are a victim of their addiction and their life is unfortunately taken by it. Now, these individuals were suffering from such a severe loss of control that they could no longer function in society. But that is very different from a narcissist who is refusing to change their behaviors because it is their character disorder that is causing their abusive behavior. It's not the addiction. The addiction is simply an excuse to abuse. They are using it as a way to excuse abusive behavior. In fact, there are some abusers who will go so far as to claim that they're having a blackout when they abused someone. They will claim that the alcohol made them do it. The fact that they had a sex addiction made them cheat on you. They'll claim that they blacked out when they said those nasty things during an argument. Whereas someone who is actually struggling with addiction will take accountability for their behavior. They will feel shame and remorse. And depending on the severity of their addiction, they may actually ask for help. They may make changes to their lifestyle. They may take concrete steps in order to make amends, to get the help they need to recover and to build healthier relationships with their loved ones. A narcissist or a psychopath, however, does not have as good of a prognosis because their addiction is only one of their problems. Their core lack of empathy is what's driving their actual abusive behavior. It's not the alcohol, it's not the sex addiction, it's their hardwired behavior since childhood of being narcissistic, of being entitled, of looking for stimulation, of being high sensation seeking. They are prone to boredom. The more psychopathic you are, the more prone to boredom you are, and the more sensation seeking you tend to be. So you look at addictions and substances not as a way to relieve the pain or the trauma or something else that you might be struggling with, but rather to pursue some sort of thrill seeking in your life. And that is very different from someone who is struggling with addiction as a result of trauma, as a result of a thrill to escapism, as a form of avoidance from PTSD related symptoms. So what happens with an addict who is not narcissistic or psychopathic is that they get into this cycle of addiction because they have this sort of initial trauma that comes with it, a lot of trauma-related reminders, and they try to avoid those trauma-related reminders because they're so overwhelming to their psyche. And by doing that, they engage in some sort of substance abuse, some sort of gambling, shopping, sex, whatever it may be, as a way to escape their trauma. And this is a cycle of negative reinforcement where a feared stimulus, which is the trauma reminder, whatever trigger that might come in, is avoided over and over again. It is avoided, and that substance provides that relief, and they come back to that substance as a form of relief over and over again.
But narcissistic individuals are quite different from regular addicts.
These types of individuals have had hardwired behaviors since childhood. Their exploitativeness, their lack of empathy is still going to remain regardless of whether or not they have an addiction or not. Someone who is actually struggling with addiction but doesn't have narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, or doesn't meet any of the criteria on Dr. Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist, however, they can be struggling with something that is very different from a character disorder, that is very different from personality disorders. And it may be because of an initial trauma that caused them to engage in substances or sex or gambling or shopping or whatever addiction it may be as a form of escapism, as a way to avoid their trauma-related reminders because those reminders were too painful. For example, for those who struggle with PTSD, substance abuse can be a comorbid issue, and they can use substances and abuse them in order to escape trauma reminders that are so overwhelming to the psyche, that is so overwhelming for the body and the mind. And substances can provide that temporary relief for that individual. And what happens is that they become conditioned through a cycle of negative reinforcement, where that overwhelming, powerful stimulus of the trauma reminder is temporarily removed as they turn to substances or any other kind of addiction to provide this small sense of comfort. And over time, they become conditioned to seek out whatever is the source of their addiction as a way to avoid their own trauma. And that is how addictions become reinforced over time. Now, if someone has a substance abuse addiction and is not narcissistic, this could actually cause changes in the brain and could actually cause them to engage in narcissistic behavior. But if they have the willingness to seek help, they have the willingness and self-awareness to reach out and to get help, they can overcome their addiction, can heal, and they can process their traumas and face their traumas, the traumas that they've been avoiding through their addiction. Now, that is very different from someone who is narcissistic or psychopathic, because someone who is narcissistic and psychopathic is seeking out addiction for a different reason. They're not trying to avoid trauma necessarily, because they've had these kind of hardwired behaviors of lack of empathy since childhood. They've had these kinds of personality characteristics and a character disorder since childhood. What they're doing is that they are prone to boredom, especially if they're a psychopath. They are emotionally impoverished. They're seeking stimulation. They're high sensation seekers. And addictions, whether that be in substances, in sex, in promiscuity, which is actually part of Dr. Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist, those provide stimulation for them. It's not an escape. It's not a sense of comfort. It's stimulation. They are bored. They want something to feed them that sense of power, control, to give them that thrill seeking that they desire. And that's part of their character disorder. That's part of their personality disorder. It is not a result of trauma necessarily. So I hope this video has helped you to differentiate between addiction and narcissism. If you have a story of your own about dealing with a narcissist who was an addict, please do leave in the comment section below sharing some of the excuses that they made, whether or not they ever recovered from their addiction, and whether or not you ever came into contact with an actual addict who wasn't a narcissist and how they behaved differently from a narcissist or a psychopath. I look forward to hearing your stories. I hope you're safe and well. I'll talk to you guys soon, and until next time, take care.